This presentation is meant to make it clear to you that really there is only one way to replace the fuels that we get from oil and use in internal combustion engines. There's over 100 years of this information. We know it very well. We know that the only way to do it and use those same internal combustion engines is with alcohols. The two alcohols that you are probably familiar with are ethanol. It's grain alcohol, it's what you drink, and also what you use in your fuel. Every gas station in the United States has at least 10% ethanol in the mixture of gasoline that it provides you, and we'll talk about that in a minute. The other alcohol is methanol. Methanol is often called wood alcohol. You don't want to drink it. You can die from it. You can go blind from it. All kinds of bad things. But then again, you don't want to drink gasoline or diesel fuel either. So let's move on from that and see if there's some real sense here in terms of what we can do to drive our cars and get off oil at the same time. Okay, cute little cartoon pointing out the real dilemma that we're in. The real dilemma is that no matter what the new invention is, and ultimately no matter how well it performs and helps us and helps our society move ahead, there will be people who cannot deal with the change. No wheels here, it says. No new technology. No, no, no. Well, we don't want to be there. We're Americans, after all. Goodness gracious, we have to move forward. That's how we got to where we are. And if we start to see that that's not right, if we don't understand that, we are going to do exactly what that phrase on the bottom says. Winston Churchill told us that those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Okay, so the outline for this talk is really in three main parts. First, we're going to ask ourselves, why do we want to get off oil? You know, some of us already think we know all of the answers, and actually we know an awful lot of it. But I want to add a little bit to your thinking. I want to make sure you understand a few of the things about your health. You're pretty good about supply and demand and economic security and the environment. We'll very quickly touch on all those. But it's your health that I'm most worried about. You understanding, because that's something, it's an everyday additive effect, and unless we really understand what it's doing, we can't do anything about it. Okay, then we're going to go, the next main part is the overview of the alternatives. We're going to briefly go through electric cars, the cost of CNG, LNG, and then look at the two different alcohol economies, the ethanol economy and the methanol economy. We'll see somewhere down the line that we can add the two together with no harmful effects and move forward quicker. And then we're going to look at some future directions that can amplify how we get out of the mess that we're in. Okay, well, let's start with the supply and then the demand and then move on. We'll do this very quickly. The red line is the oil supply in the United States. This includes the Gulf of Mexico. It includes Alaska. I drew some straight lines there to show you how quickly the contiguous 48 states oil supply has been decreasing. The next red line is that little bump is all that oil that we get from the Gulf, and the red line, the bump up to the red line, includes the extra oil we get from Alaska. This goes to about 2005. We understand that there's additional oil and shale in the Dakotas, and that number is going to increase this by some other little bump. People are saying it's about the same, it may be less. So moving on from there, what we see on this curve is the blue line is our demand. Our demand is ridiculously, incessantly increasing. Of course, there was that little jiggle in the early 1980s, but it has gone up like a rocket since then. And it's very, very clear that our demand has outstripped our supply. Okay, so that's our picture. But what about the world's picture? Well, the biggest part of the world that we have to deal with at the moment is China. So I've got China's growth rate on here. in the United States' growth rate, and just an example of a third world, well, it's not a third world country, but a smaller country, Australia, essentially no growth rate there. We grew at 2% over a century. That includes 2 world wars. Okay, China, which essentially did nothing for a half a century, and then started to shoot up, is now growing. I drew a line through their curve here at 7%. Just so you know, in 2009 they grew 8.3%. In 2010 they grew 10.9%. They're slowing down now towards 8%, and Wall Street is panicked. But the ridiculous fact is that if they just stayed at 7%, yeah, there are wiggles around my line, but they just stayed at 7% by 2015, they will have doubled our carbon footprint. They're already greater than we are, but they will have doubled it. Well, what the heck does this all mean? One way to see what it means is look at this Goldman Sachs table about the number of cars, the growth in the number of cars over the next 40 years. They're going to be 4 times as many cars on the road. Very large number of those additional cars will be in China and India and Malaysia and Saudi Arabia, etc., etc. But 4 times as many cars. Goldman figures that there might only be twice as much oil. Well, either those cars are going to have to be twice as efficient across the board, or we're in really big trouble. And the issue here is that we cannot sustain the kind of driving and the size of the cars that we are using now on gasoline. Maybe, and that's one of the points of this talk, maybe we can sustain all that by using a different fuel. Let's see. Okay, we're going to get to that. But first we need to know that the fuel we are using is really making a mess of our environment. These are 2 pictures. The left-hand side is the average good day in Phoenix. The right-hand side is the average bad day. Well, you can easily see that you lose the mountains. You effectively lose the sky. We're living in this sewer. It's only going to get worse if we stay on gasoline, oil, diesel fuel. All right, jumping around here because you know a lot of this stuff. Let's look at unemployment versus the price of oil. There are 2 curves on this plot. There's no reason to change the colors of them. One is the unemployment rate in the United States, and the other is the cost of oil per barrel in the United States over 45 years. If you can't see how well correlated these 2 curves are, I doubt if you'll get anything else out of the rest of this talk. That correlation is so dramatic that if we keep the oil prices up high, we are not going to regain that employment. We are going to have massive amounts of people out of work, perhaps for the rest of our lifetime and our children's, and maybe beyond. We need to decorrelate our need for oil and our understanding of how to get jobs and what jobs are all about and how to have active in employment. One more really quick slide. If OPEC turned off the valve, sort of like they did in 1973 for a very short time, if they turn it off again, and the reasons are endless. You know more than I probably can tell you. If they turn off the valve, we die. That's all there is to it. Our commerce, our American life as we know it, would stop on the dime. Okay, let's move on to our health. I'm going to start from the beginning of the problem, largely. The beginning of the problem was World War I. In World War I, they discovered that you can add a chemical to gasoline. The chemical was called tetraethyl lead to gasoline, and you could significantly improve its octane rating. If you can improve its octane rating, you can improve its performance. You get more power out of the engine. Okay, now lead has been in our gasoline for a very long time, maybe 5 or 6 decades. During that time, the 2 middle bullets on this slide, became really clear. One is that low levels of exposure of lead to children could lead to lower IQ, could lead to reading and learning disabilities, to impaired hearing, to hyperactivity, we know a lot about that, and impaired growth. Well, how about adults? Acute exposure to adults, my God, if you're a gasoline station pumping attendant, for example, but it doesn't only have to be that. You could get blind, you could have brain damage, you could have kidney damage, you could have cancers, you could even die, straight out. Well, all this was actually known for a long time. But the oil companies knew that lead gave them an advantage at a cheap price, and they weren't going to go near admitting to that. Reminds me of the tobacco companies. In any case, lead was never, and you have to, this has got to be, build this into your psychic. If not, you're going to be a kindergartner the rest of your life. Lead was never directly legislated out for health reasons, in spite of knowing all those things. The forces of the economic forces of the oil and oil companies were so strong that even the most beneficent congressmen and senators could not marshal enough forces together to really kill the lead. You know how it got out? It got out for a totally different reason. Somebody, as they say, came in from left field and forced it out. Well, as it turned out, for reasons of the Clean Air Act, we needed catalytic converters on our cars. It became necessary to have catalytic converters to cut down all kinds of other emissions. I don't have time to go through all that. But lead destroys catalytic converters. So to get those cars on the road legally, the oil companies had to get the lead out of the gasoline. That's why it's out now. Not because they give a damn about us or our children. So what do? They replace the lead with something called MTBE. It's not necessary for me to go through these 4,000 letter words. It's a chemical that also boosts the octane in gasoline. If they can get the octane up, they can provide you at the refinery with a much cheaper basic stock, so they make more money and you get the performance that you think you should get. Well, 1979, this stuff comes in, and when it came in, they threw in a few other things too, like benzene and toluene, just to make that octane rating get up to what the lead was able to do before. They needed about 10 to 15% of this MTBE in there. Well, in terms of the other aromatics like the benzene and the toluene, gasoline could have had, and might still have, as much as 50% of these other products in there. Well, one thing at a time. Let's hit the MTBE. They found it was a carcinogen. It gave you cancer. Well, MTBE would leak out of fuel tanks at gas stations and during distribution into the ground, onto the ground, and then into the groundwater. When MTBE got in the groundwater, it stayed there for essentially forever. So you were drinking basically water that would give you cancer. That eventually got to the point where it was legislated out. But before we get there, let me point out that the other thing they put into gasoline to get that octane rating up, so you had the power you expected from a gallon of gasoline, was benzene. Now, benzene is a carcinogen also. It will give you leukemia. We'll mention that a little bit more later. But they figured, well, with the three-way catalytic converters that they had to put in there when they got rid of the lead, they put those things in, the benzene would basically get destroyed by the catalytic converter. Now, what has turned out to be the case, and it took the Swiss to tell us this, is that they were right. The EPA was right. The car companies were right when they did the tests on a bench stand at a constant speed, at an equilibrium rate of engine revolutions. The Swiss took the cars out on the highway, figured out a way to measure this on a moving car. And guess what? They found that there were up to 2 orders of magnitude. That means an order of magnitude is 10 times. 2 orders of magnitude means 100 times more benzene coming out of the tailpipe than we had thought there was. Now, you have to really understand that when you go to a gas station and you fill up your tank, that filler cap, by the way, if it's not sealed right, it's leaking all through your garage and filling your garage up with high levels of benzene overnight. But let's say it's on okay. When you put that nozzle into your gas tank, turn your head. Otherwise, you're sucking in carcinogenic benzene. Well, the World Health Organization, WHO, says that 1 part per million of benzene is considered acceptable. You can argue what acceptable amount of cancer is, but let's just accept that for the moment. Well, the United States EPA says that there's probably 10 times this much in US air in the cities that they have measured. And then that Swiss study I just mentioned calculated that 100 times that much can be emitted from the tailpipe of an accelerating vehicle. Benzene's a really big problem, and the oil companies, are so powerful that you almost cannot find any literature about this. You've got to go really into the professional academic literature to read about these stories. But I want you to know about them. So when they finally found that the MTBE got into the water supply, now water somehow is far more carefully regulated than air. Benzene can get into the air, they will get away with murder. Anything gets in the water, thank goodness, at least in the United States, it really is jumped on by the regulators, and in this case, they removed the MTBE from the additives in gasoline. So they had to replace them with something. If not, your car wouldn't run the way you expect it to run on that fuel. They replaced it with ethanol. 10% ethanol is in your gasoline almost in every pump in the United States. Now, ethanol is medically okay. We drink it in beer and whiskey, and we've been doing this for pretty much the history of mankind. We're okay on ethanol there. Where we're not okay on ethanol is the way that, at least in the United States, it is made. It is made from corn. Corn is a foodstuff that we use for a lot of purposes. We feed our animals, we feed ourselves, we make sugars and all kinds of syrups and things from it. But here we've decided that we're going to make ethanol, which you can, from the corn. You just distill it and use it as fuel. Well, up to a certain amount, we can get away with this okay. But the question really is, what is that amount? And we know over the past 4 or 5 years that the price of corn has gone from like $2.50 a bushel just a few weeks ago was $8 plus a bushel. Now, this means that the cows they feed and the beef you buy, or whatever the animal is, chicken, pork, will cost more, significantly more. And, of course, there are people around the rest of the world who will not get any surplus corn from the United States anymore for basic food needs because we're burning it in our cars. But now let's hold. I want you not to cut off your thinking about alcohols just because the United States makes it from corn. Ethanol can be made from other sources. The really great example of this is Brazil. Brazil makes huge amounts of ethanol from sugarcane. Making it from sugarcane is much more efficient than making it from corn. And as it turns out, it's a very viable process. There are a lot of other countries in the equatorial belt that could grow sugarcane and make ethanol from it and actually grow their economies. So we'll get back to that. So it's not all bad. It's just unbelievably wrong and stupid for the United States to consider it, because it's talking about doing 3 times as much as it's doing now. And that would be a real problem. It might be able to sustain the amount it produced in 2011, which was something like, after all is said and done and they fed the cows from the mash and all this, there's still about 32% of the corn was directly put into your car and mine. Okay, now there are other alcohols. It's very important to know that. There are other alcohols. The one other one, and it's even simpler than ethanol, it burns cleaner. It has the possibility of even giving you more power, is methanol. Methanol can be made from natural gas. As it turns out, in the United States, boy, do we have a lot of natural gas. We have so much. We're stopping drilling new wells. We're thinking about liquefying it and sending it across the oceans to Japan and China and whoever else wants to buy it. Leaving this country while at the same time we're taking in hundreds of billions of dollars of this oil, which we have to supplement with benzene and other things so that our cars run right when we convert it to gasoline. I want you to think about this, because the rest of the talk is going to give you details. Don't give up on me now. This is really important. We all have to get on board with the fact that we're being duped, that we really can do better than what is presented to us. Now, let's talk about presentation. The way it's been presented to us is through these E85 or flex fuel vehicles, which can run on 85% ethanol. This is really kind of interesting, right? But the way the American automobile manufacturers, and not only the Americans, but largely the Americans, have made these cars, they run with lower power and lower mileage on the E85, on the 85% ethanol, 15% gasoline mixture. That makes every American think alcohols are really not very good fuels. Well, that's actually wrong. And I'm going to show you why it's wrong. We're going to see, because it has been proven that it's wrong. And once you understand this, you can make some headway. You can do something positive about your life and your situation with respect to oil, benzene, and driving. The way we're going to solve this problem is first to change our point of view. Now, if you were all in the computer world, you would understand the word legacy. If you have legacy software and you've got to run it on a certain kind of piece of hardware, you cannot make use of modern tools. You cannot make use of different central processing units in computers that might be much, much faster if the software can be changed to solve the problem that you want. Well, legacy applies in terms of fuels in our cars also. One of the problems here is that in the automobile company's perspective and the oil company's perspective is to stay on oil, so that everything else they do wants to look like an additive to oil, a slight change around the basic oil situation. Now, we need to change that. Henry Ford, 100 years ago, knew that that was not the way to do it. He understood that alcohols have higher octane. Octane's everything in an internal combustion engine. If you make everything reference to gasoline, i.e. legacy processes and procedures, if you do that, then everything you do in the way of adding alcohol to the system will look like a poor cousin. What we need to do in our transition away from oil is to make gasoline and diesel fuel the additives, not the standard that we're trying to modify. We have to make something else the standard, and we're going to argue that that's alcohols, not gasoline. Okay, so now we're into part 2 of our outline. Part 2 of our outline is going to very briefly take you through what you might think or have been led to think are the important alternatives to where you are now. We're going to do electric cars. We're not even going to bother, well, we'll very briefly talk about fuel cells. Electric cars, compressed natural gas or liquefied natural gas, awful lot of pressure on that right now from God knows everybody, including T. Boone Pickens. I was a disciple, so I'm talking to you from experience to tell you there's something better than the Pickens plan. We're going to talk about that. Then we're going to talk about ethanol, and then we're going to talk about methanol. That's part 2 of this, and later on we'll get to future directions. Okay, electric cars first. Look, electric cars require battery chemistry technology that is way better than we have now. You have to understand that using lithium-ion batteries, which are twice as energy dense as nickel metal hydride batteries, are still not good enough. The point really is that 80 miles or 100 miles or 40 miles on a $15,000 or $20,000 propulsion system, which the batteries essentially are, they're the energetics of the electric motors, is not good enough for the way the American driver uses his or her vehicle. And the penalty for doing that is multifold. First, there's the cost of the car. Second, is the fact that the electricity you're using in this country, somewhere between 40 and 50% of it, is made from coal. And coal is really dirty. It's putting a lot of CO2 into the world's air. It's creating a warmer climate, whether you believe it or you don't. It certainly is. So it is not greenhouse gas zero. At the tailpipe it is. But by putting it into that plug in your wall, it certainly is not. The other thing is, it takes a very long time to charge that car. Maybe 8 hours, maybe 10 hours, maybe 12 hours. And when you're only going 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 miles on this car, you have an incredible liability. This is not the kind of driving Americans are used to. So between the range, and then there's the issues of durability and safety, and just the fact that that car is not going to be able to carry the loads you're used to. It's got to be basically this very small, lightweight car. So electric cars are not here now. What the people in the battery business say is that every decade there's roughly a 10% improvement in battery technology. Well, 10% improvement per decade means it'll take 100 years to basically double this range cost issue. We don't have the time. We need to move on from battery technology. How about fuel cells, really quick? Fuel cells. Well, there's sort of three kinds of fuel cells that ultimately may make it into cars. The first are the platinum electrode fuel cells, the platinum membrane fuel cells, or they call them PEM fuel cells. They need hydrogen to run. Hydrogen is just ridiculously difficult to manage as a fuel carrier, as an energy carrier. It's very expensive. It leaks everywhere. It's very hard to purify to those levels, very expensive. It's not going to come down the road very easily. Now, those PEM fuel cells, by the way, could run on methanol, which could be reformed right there in the car fairly well. But the PEM fuel cells have other problems. In particular, they can be poisoned by sulfur in the air. There's plenty of sulfur in the air. You stop at a stoplight behind a bus or a big pickup truck or something, and you could leave that stoplight impaired, significantly impaired, a few tenths of a percentage point less horsepower than you came to that stoplight at. Imagine that at a few stoplights. It wouldn't take long for your very expensive car to not be worth very much. There are these things called DMFCs, direct methanol fuel cells. They have even higher amounts of platinum in them, and platinum is the most expensive part, also subject to all of these poisoning issues. The one that may one day win out are these things called SOFCs. These are solid oxide fuel cells. They're largely made with sand, silicon dioxide, and they don't need the platinum. The real problem is, so they're certainly the lowest cost. The real problem is, right now, they have very low reliability. They're used in some stationary power sources, but in the car situation, we have a lot of vibrations. There's a long way to go before solid oxide fuel cells are going to become a power source for cars. So the bottom line is we need a minimum of 2 decades, and first the solid oxide fuel cells may show up to be the winners, and then maybe somebody will discover a way to cut the platinum, the amount of platinum needed, to a dramatically lower amount, and therefore the cost, and then somebody else, or the same people, will discover how to keep them from being poisoned. Anyway, we're moving from fuel cells. Another fantasy of the automobile and the oil companies. They put lots of money into this, by the way. They need to divert your attention from the reality of alcohol, and they've done a darn good job for that decade. Next decade, CNG, LNG. That's compressed natural gas or liquefied natural gas. This is currently very popular. It's been made very popular by T. Boone Pickens and a lot of advertising from the very large natural gas companies. Now, in the end, we're going to use natural gas. Don't go away from that. But we're not going to use it as compressed or liquefied natural gas. As the banner that they use, this is their banner, says here, it is definitely clean. It is definitely abundant. It is definitely American. But it is not affordable. It is not affordable. Let me first show you what you have to do, and then we'll show some numbers at you. Here's a car. It's a van, minivan. It's converted to CNG. If you can see the fuel tanks there in the cutout version, you need some tanks. They have to take up a reasonable amount of space, quite a reasonable amount of space, but they have to hold 3,600 psi, pounds per square inch of natural gas. They have to be very substantial tanks. They have to be all hooked up together. The engine has to have different injectors. The modification to make a car a CNG car is $7,500 to $12,000, depends on the manufacturer, depends on the car. Honda Civic is roughly $10,000 more if it's a natural gas version, and you have only half the trunk because they stick one of those big cylinders in the trunk. You don't want to go natural gas, way too expensive on the car front. Well, how about filling up? The filling stations have a real hit to take. A dispenser like this one at UCLA, it's the University of California, Los Angeles campus, $300,000 to $500,000. That's $500,000 per dispenser to install. Never mind maintain, just install. So if you add this all up, what it amounts to basically, let's say we wanted to get off oil by going on to compressed and or liquefied natural gas. It would take roughly 100 times as much money to do that as it would take to make a completely flex fuel vehicle that could run on any kind of alcohol gasoline mixture. 100 times. Now, let's look at that in real money. What does that mean? Okay, what is our national debt? Our national debt, which is so occupying all the politicians in this election year. Our national debt's the order of $14 trillion. Now, what is our gross national product? Our gross national product is also the order of $14 trillion. Well, do you realize that at the cost that I just put forward to you for these cars and dispensers, it would cost the order of $3 trillion, $3 trillion, or 21.5% of our gross national product, to get our fleet of vehicles off oil. Well, we cannot afford that. No country can afford to do that. No country. Let me a couple of examples. Okay? When we built the most extensive public works system ever, our interstate highway system, thanks to President Eisenhower, it's been a very good thing for us, by the way. It took 1.4% of our gross national product in 1958 to do this. When we fought for our lives against Hitler, and the Japanese, World War II, at its peak, cost us 44% of our gross national product. This is including making the atomic bomb and all this stuff. So the idea that we are, because we want to have cheaper fuel and we want to have cleaner air, are going to spend 21.5% of our gross national product is actually absurd. It's not a societal solution. We will muddle through with what we have until we die of benzene, die of lack of transportation, or simply cannot afford the luxuries and enjoyment of life that we currently have with our vehicles. Well, what do we do? What can we do? Where do we go from here? Is there anything we can do? And the answer is yes, 100% yes. What we need to do first is we need to stay with liquids. We need basically as close to a drop-in, they call it drop-in. Department of Energy loves this word. Now, we're not going to have exactly drop-in. Drop-in is for fanciful Walt Disney 13-year-olds. What we are going to have is a fairly close to drop-in liquid fuel. It's going to be alcohols. And let's look at it because we already have this. We have it in the form of ethanol. To convert a car, the second bullet here points out very clearly by the vice chairman of General Motors himself, Tom Steffens, that it will add as much as, it doesn't mean always, as much as $70 to the production cost to make it flex fuel. Well, when he's talking flex fuel, he means gasoline and ethanol. If it went all the way to including methanol, it might add another $30, is the general point of view. Another $30. So many of these cars are costing $30,000 to $40,000 and $50,000. The $70 is in the noise. Okay. Well, do alcohols work? Henry Ford, actually no slough in the auto business, 100 years ago said yes. Not only did he say yes, he said they work better. He knew it then. It's been true ever since. But he knew it then, and he tried to make alcohol from ethanol, largely, from farm products, be the source of fuel for his cars. Well, he had marginal success on that. Initially had a lot of success. But then Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller, who had these oil wells that he was largely using to make kerosene for fuel as a lamp oil fuel, realized he could use the wastes from his distillation process to make an internal combustion engine turn over. He could run your engine on gasoline. That waste was gasoline. Well, for a long time, there was a tit for tat between alcohol and gasoline. In the cities, it was sort of easier to get the gasoline in there. In the farms, they used alcohol. And then along came this idea of prohibition. Rockefeller strongly supported prohibition. Prohibition came in 1919, the Volstead Act, and stayed as a constitutional amendment for 13 or 14 years. And in that 13 or 14 years, you couldn't make any alcohol. So Rockefeller's gasoline was what you drove your car on. It was during that time cars became an important part of Americans' lives, and Rockefeller cemented the idea of gasoline to run them. Well, let's go back to alcohol. Now we're gonna look at the two subsets of this outline: the ethanol economy and the methanol economy. Both alcohols. The ethanol economy is more or less where we're edging into right now. Every gas station has 10% ethanol in its gasoline. Clearly, The strong proponents are the corn states, the sugarcane industry across the whole of the equatorial belt of the world, but Brazil is the biggest proponent. You can make ethanol very nicely from sugarcane, by the way, much more efficiently than you can make it from corn. But there are other ways to make ethanol. You can make ethanol from waste products. Now you need, it's a more intensive process. You need the right kind of enzymes or bacteria or heat and pressure. But it can be done, and we're learning how to do it every day more efficiently. You can also make it from natural gas. And this actually may be a key for the way we move off of corn using ethanol to fuel our vehicles. We're going to talk about its performance in both internal combustion engines, we call them ICE engines, and diesel engines. You can use ethanol in fuel cells, though methanol is better. We'll talk about its water usage and how much fertilizer it needs, and the fact that there's only so much you can grow because we have only so much arable land. In its wheel-to-wheel CO2 emission picture. But the basic message here is ethanol can work, and I'm going to show you that. Now I'm going to show you the science behind it working, the engineering results. But the fact is we only can make it work up to 20 or 30% of our needs. And that's the main picture. So when we go to alcohol, we will probably maintain a certain proportion of the alcohol in our fuel systems picture being ethanol. But it can't do the whole job. It cannot do the whole job. Okay. Now, the very first thing we have to do is realize that the car companies, when you have an E85 car out there in America, you're getting worse mileage and worse performance. The car companies don't like this idea. It's not, in their mind, the way they want to go. However, one car company, Saab, in Sweden, used to be owned by General Motors, by the way. General Motors let them die. Said, okay, you want to go E85? Let's go. Let's go bio. Let's get off of the CO2, net CO2. Let's make our cars run really well on ethanol. There are a couple of 3 cars in this picture. All get more power and more mileage on ethanol than they were getting on gasoline. Now, how did they do it? They did it by reprogramming the onboard computer to take into account the extra octane that ethanol has in it. You don't need lead, and you don't need MTBE, and you don't need benzene. You don't need any of that, because in alcohol there is inherently a lot of octane. Ethanol has 108 octane. Methanol might have 110 octane. That's why they use it in racing vehicles. But you could use it on a street car if it's designed for it. And the Swedes did that. Okay, now to do it in a car that allows you to also use gasoline, you have to have some way to change the compression of the fuel charge in the cylinders, or that's called the compression ratio. The compression ratio can be changed in a variable way by having turbochargers on that engine. If you have turbochargers on the engine, the computer you have on board can tell those turbochargers to increase the so-called boost, the pressure of the air coming in to the cylinders. That increases the effective compression ratio. Okay, if you increase the compression ratio and you have higher octane, you don't backfire. If you don't backfire, you get more power. If you get more power, that ethanol is doing a good job for you. Okay, so Saab did that. Here, an example is they took this 4-cylinder straight engine, actually it's a Buick engine, believe it or not, 150 horsepower on gasoline, and they showed, very simply, those cars are on the road, there are quite a few of them, that they get 180 horsepower on E85. On E85. They still have 15% gasoline in there. but they can get 180 horsepower and 40 newton meters more of torque. More torque and more horsepower, 20% more horsepower. In America, the cars they designed for us, why? Somebody will tell us one day. Somebody will be in court one day. Why they designed them for us so that they get less horsepower and less torque on that ethanol. Who's in charge? Okay. For you folks out there who are engineering oriented, I just wanted to show you what the efficiency of the engine that Saab used, Buick engine, was when they ran on 95, 98, and ethanol. 98 octane, 95 octane, and E85. You can see the red line is E85. The gray line is a diesel engine, which actually doesn't meet up to the E85. Now watch this. This $4.5 million car also has an E85 version. It gets 1/3 more horsepower when you run it on E85. And now we're talking 1,200 and something horsepower versus 800 and something horsepower on gasoline. So even at the high end of the luxury picture, ethanol pays off. Okay, at the Geneva Auto Show in 2007, the president of Saab went a step further. Now it turns out this may or may not run. We're going to try it. I want him to tell you the story. And the story goes something like this.
The biopower story started some years ago, but today the 95 biopower is the most sold flex fuel vehicle in Europe, and it confirms our commitment to this renewable fuel, our commitment to reduce the emission of carbon dioxide. And today we are introducing a new concept, the Biopower 100, a concept based on 100% ethanol, a concept that will describe the potential for the future. In that vehicle today we are showing how we, with a donor vehicle of a 150 horsepower, could get 300 horsepower. But we wanted to show that we can get 150 horsepower per liter. So the car only needs 150 horsepower. So theoretically, it will only need a 1 liter engine. The future will not be a 1 liter engine, maybe 1.5 liter engine. So that's what you'll see in the future. You'll be seeing lighter, smaller, more efficient engines running on 100% ethanol, and by that giving the customer his part, at the same time reducing the carbon dioxide emissions.
Okay, so what this guy just told you is that by using 100% ethanol, you could optimize an internal combustion engine, a spark-ignited internal combustion engine that originally was running at 150 horsepower on gasoline and make it run up to 300 horsepower. You doubled the power. You doubled the power. What that means is that if you don't make it use all that power, you're using less fuel. So you can significantly either increase the mileage or increase the power available to you for the fun of driving. Now, this actually, years earlier, was verified by our own EPA. The EPA Engine Research Lab in Ann Arbor, Michigan, under Matt Brustar, did a series of work for many years and wrote papers on it in the Society of Automotive Engineers that showed that they could take an engine, a VW turbo direct injected diesel engine, pull out the fuel injectors, put spark plugs in the thing, it was still running at 19.5 to 1. Nice high compression ratio. But they could run it more efficiently on either ethanol or methanol than they could on the diesel fuel it was designed for. Now, that means that that engine would be cheaper if it ran on ethanol or methanol. It could be actually made smaller, just like the Swedes suggested, and therefore it would be lighter, cheaper, and because it weighed less, you'd use less gasoline. Because it was smaller, it would use, or fuel, you would use less fuel. It would be win-win. MIT, totally independently, did another study on the value of using alcohol in a spark-ignited internal combustion engine, and they conclude, and they were looking at big vehicles, that a 15-liter engine, this is the kind of engine you put in an 18-wheeler, it trucks along the highway and carries so much of our goods, that engine could be downsized to 7 liters, half, which means half the weight, half the cost, half the fuel, half the emissions, if we ran on alcohol. Okay, once again, for the engineers, and I hope you appreciate this, these are two plots. They're showing brake mean effective pressure on the ordinate and versus RPM on the abscissa, on the x-axis. And you can see the 40% line of that Volkswagen direct injected diesel engine running on diesel fuel. It had a 40% contour in that little circle in the middle there. When they ran this thing on ethanol, on 100% ethanol, that 40% contour widened. I'll show you later on methanol, widens even more. This really means a lot of things. One, it means taking out all that diesel injection, very high pressure, greater than 100,000 psi, direct rail injection system, would mean that engine's less expensive. Also, you don't need the particle filter, the diesel particle filter on the downstream end, and you don't need the urea filter to keep the NOx down, because there's so little NOx coming out of alcohol when you burn it. Totally unlike diesel fuel. So you don't need diesel engines anymore. It's really the message. You don't need the diesel fuel at its cost, and you don't need the diesel engines with their pollution problems. Okay, let's go a step further. Step further is that the EPA, also done this, said, well, how far down can I cut that amount of ethanol in the mixture and still get an equal amount or greater power than if I ran on gasoline only? And what they determined is that if they go down to E30, that is 30% ethanol, the rest is gasoline, that they could get an estimated 10 to 12% gain in fuel economy. Gain. So that more than compensates for the approximately 8% loss in the energy density because the alcohol is lighter, has less energy per unit volume, than straight gasoline. More than compensates. So in a way, E30 is a magic number. We're not allowed in this country to do more than E10 at the moment. Okay, back up to higher percentages of ethanol. In Sweden, don't ever say that we are the most advanced engineering country in the world. We are hobbled by our politics and by our history. And we're becoming hobbled to the extent that we are really going to suffer for it. Swedes, for 15 years, have a set of buses that run at 44% efficiency on 95% ethanol. Diesel buses, diesel engines, previously diesel engines. We need to do this. This is way better than compressed natural gas. We need to do this. Okay, now we know ethanol has only 2/3 of the energy per unit volume of gasoline. But because we can run it at higher compression ratios and get more power out of the thing, this almost essentially goes away. Okay, now what's happening here in the United States? Well, if you had a car that was an E85 car, 2002 or earlier, you really lost essentially all of that energy. You lost 30% when you ran it on E85. Okay? Somehow, and nobody's telling us, but they better tell us one of these days pretty quick, after 2003, it seemed that the loss was reduced to only 15 to 17%. And now, in some of the newest American vehicles, you only lose 5 to 15% running on that E85. So they are doing things, without even telling us, behind the scenes, that are making these things better. But at the same time, we have this impression that they're horrible back pre-2002. And I'm telling you that Saab and other companies, I'm going to show you some other ones, have actually broke this cycle already. Okay. So are we being manipulated by basically business-directed engineering? Well, there are all of these bullets here, some showing that Chevy Tahoes are losing 28% of the mileage, and Ford Tauruses are only losing 6%. But then the two middle bullets are really exciting because Honda Civics in Brazil and Honda Fits, the fourth bullet, in Brazil, are essentially losing nothing as they go down from 100% ethanol all the way down to 20%. Those cars are designed around using alcohol. Our cars are designed around using gasoline. It's the wrong approach. It's hurting all of us. It's costing all of us money, all of us emissions, all of us just basically a loss of our American livelihood. We have to fight this. Now, the kind words of the American auto industry sort of suggest the yellow line, i.e., the flex fuel vehicle engine is more of an infant technology rather than fully mature. Well, I say bullshit to that. I say we are being manipulated by our car companies in cahoots with their oil companies so that we really do not favor alternative fuels. In particular, so that we do not favor alcohol fuels. Okay, now let's get a little realistic about ethanol. Ethanol is not all good. It uses a lot of water. You got to grow that corn over a whole season. Then you've got to do the fermentation process in the ethanol factories. And in the end, you're using something like 2,350 gallons of water to go 100 miles on ethanol. That's what that top long bar is. That's a log scale on the x-axis. Every vertical division is a factor of 10 more than the other. Okay? Have to do it this way to show it all on one graph. Gasoline is the other star on there, the other asterisk, the large asterisk in yellow bar. Gasoline only uses 10 gallons of water to allow you to drive 100 miles. So ethanol really has a problem here. It's 100 times more water, okay, than just making gasoline. Well, as it turns out, you can make methanol for either 0 water, there are certain ways I'll show you later, and or about 20 gallons of water per 100 miles that you drive. So as we look at alcohols, we're going to want to see what the options are to get away from ethanol. Okay. Before we leave it, though, we want to point out to you that there are a number of non-corn ethanol sources that are actually reasonably good. Now look, the immediately obvious one that's in practice right now is sugarcane. Brazil is a huge country making huge amounts of ethanol, driving their cars on it, very large number of their cars on it. They don't need to water the sugarcane. It's in the equatorial belts, gets plenty of water. It's very efficient to make ethanol from sugarcane. We could do this in Hawaii too. We used to grow sugarcane in Hawaii. For example, we grow some sugarcane in Florida, but not nearly enough to meet our needs of ethanol. We could also, in much colder climates, grow sugar beets. There are a lot of countries that could make a living on sugar beet ethanol around the world. Something to keep in mind. But now let's move away from otherwise food crops and think about the fact that ethanol can be made from natural gas very, very efficiently, actually. Celanese is a company. They have a process for making ethanol from natural gas for roughly $1.50 a gallon. Pretty good. Okay, now there are other companies that will make ethanol from essentially totally waste materials. Joule is one of them. They'll make ethanol from wastewater, CO2, and sunlight. Then there are companies like Costaca, DuPont Danisco, Fulcrum Bio, Maxcoma, Range Fuels, Didactic, Poet, Iogen, Abengoa, that are all trying to make these ethanol from what they call cellulistic ethanol from waste, like corn husks, wood chips, and other human and inorganic wastes. There's a huge effort in Japan under the Research Institute of Innovative Technology, which is largely funded by Honda, to do the same thing. So ethanol is going to come from lots of other sources, hopefully cheaper, and definitely non-food sources. So we keep ethanol in mind. Just because we're using it in this country largely from corn now, doesn't mean it's going to stay that way. Well, let's move on now. The other alcohol is methanol. Methanol is a really important alcohol. Already in the world, there's something like 100 million tons, 100 million tons of methanol made annually for all kinds of chemical reasons. They make formaldehyde out of it to make building materials. They make all kinds of, it's a base for all kinds of chemicals. But we want to actually use methanol as a fuel. Methanol will be a great fuel. In fact, all these bullets aside, it will be the cheapest liquid fuel we could possibly make. And it will have the largest number of non-food sources. And one of the really largest ones is natural gas, of which we have a huge amount. So how does a car run on methanol? Well, here's that same Volkswagen diesel engine in the mid-90s that the EPA was testing earlier on ethanol, running on methanol. On 100% methanol, if you look at the contour plots here, again, a brake mean effective pressure versus RPM, you see the methanol ones are on the left. The diesel engine running on diesel fuel is on the right. The 40% contour, which I've lightly shaded in, is much larger running on methanol than on diesel fuel. That engine runs thermodynamically more efficiently on methanol than it does on the fuel it was built for, than it does on diesel fuel. This means we do not need diesel engines. We don't need to knock down primeval forests and put up palm trees. We don't need biodiesel. We don't need to have a second line of product. We could downsize engines, run them on alcohol, completely win out in terms of the cost going in, the emissions going out. and basically the whole cost of running the thing. It'll be lighter, cheaper, smaller, just a very much better engine. We need to move to methanol and or ethanol. MIT's approach or comments on this basically say that you can save $10,000 to $15,000 on the engine alone. Just on the engine. Never mind the fact that it'll later allow you to carry more cargo because it weighs half as much, etc., etc., etc. If you ran an engine on a large engine, the kind that can run an 18-wheeler, on methanol rather than on diesel fuel. You'll have reduced maintenance. Certainly fuel will cost less, and you'll get better mileage. Imagine. Okay. Now, I just want to reinforce the fact, we talked about this earlier, that if you actually don't have 100% of the alcohol, this is a set of plots again by the EPA using 30% ethanol. What you can see here versus the diesel. Diesel engine in this case is on the left. The engine converted to running on ethanol, only 30% is on the right. Ethanol doesn't quite give you the efficiency, 30% ethanol. 30%, the rest 70% gasoline. Doesn't quite give you the efficiency of the diesel engine on diesel fuel, but it comes awfully close. Awfully close. It gets up to 30%, 38% efficiency versus the 40% of the diesel fuel. Essentially, once again, you have the efficiency of a diesel engine when you're running on really a very low mixture of alcohol, only 30%. We could do this almost overnight. You won't need diesel engines with all their extra cost, all their extra weight, all their extra emissions, all the extra cost of diesel fuel. All that could go away. So a truck like this literally could have half the size of the engine that it has in it right now and get the same power and the same torque. Now, MIT is being very conservative. They only want to half size it. But their experiments and their computer programs said that they'll get up to 3 times the power density running on the alcohols, on the methanol, than on diesel fuel. They're only saying cut it in half. It's possible with a little research, if we put our country's mind to it, that we might even get that engine down to 1/3 the size. 1/3. Imagine the weight, the cost, the extra weight you could carry in cargo, the much greater fuel economy of a much smaller engine, all the way around a win. We got to get off oil. Okay? So methanol has half the energy per unit volume of gasoline or diesel fuel. So you would need a slightly bigger fuel tank on that truck or under the flooring of your car. Remember, it's a liquid. It's not under high pressure like compressed natural gas, so, or propane, or no pressure at all. It's at atmospheric pressure. So building a slightly larger fuel tank and all that space you have under your car would be essentially a no-brainer and essentially very low-cost addition. Well, what about greenhouse gases? Greenhouse gases are a big problem. Over the next 44 decades or so, the world as a whole has said, this is the critical period. We have to do a lot to try to reduce them. Well, on the surface, going to alcohol fuels like methanol will not make much of a change if you make the methanol from natural gas, which is how most methanol is made right now. The issue is this. The issue is that it's the same amount of greenhouse gases as gasoline. That's what that line's all about. Okay? But it can be much less. Look at the circled the circled column at the end. it's showing very, very little additional greenhouse gas. Now, both in Sweden and in Germany, using very different techniques, they are making methanol that essentially has no net wheel-to-tank greenhouse gas contribution. This is very, very important. You can make methanol from organic wastes. In Germany, they're making it from sewage sludge. In Sweden, they're making it from the waste from paper mills. But we have, in America, we are the Saudi Arabia of wastes. We have more waste, something like 4.5 pounds per person, than any other country in the world. So, if we refocus our energies and our thoughts to taking that waste and making methanol from it, we can have a very, very green world and a very, very exciting driving experience. We don't have to shrink down to tiny little cars that run on batteries for 40 miles. We could keep our vehicles, the ones we love, enjoy them, and even get more power out of them. What about safety? Well, safety is a really big issue, and methanol wins out over gasoline hands down. You all probably know that the Indy 500 and many, many other races for years, over 4 decades, have gone off gasoline onto methanol because it burns much cooler, 1/6 of the heat, and much cleaner. So you can see where the fire needs to be put out, where the person is that needs to have the hose on them, and you can put methanol fires out with water. Cannot do that with gasoline. It's much, much safer. The Society of Automotive Engineers says that there'd be a 90% reduction in fuel-related automobile fires if cars were running on methanol. It's a hands-down win. How about making methanol from biomethanol processes, i.e. not using natural gas? Well, there's a whole slew of ways to do that. Again, you can do it with, as I mentioned, there's a company named Schwarze Pump that makes huge amounts of methanol from sewage sludge and industrial wastes. It's a company called BioMCM. It makes it from glycerin, waste glycerin. Company in Sweden, together with Haldor Tipapso, that makes it from waste from paper mills. And they were going to do this in Michigan right before the recession shut them down. That may pick up again. You can do it from landfill gases. You can do it from human wastes. You can do it from cow manure. You can do it from wood particles. All kinds of forest wastes. Okay. How about, let's go back to how are we going to get there? So you can do it. You want to get there, but we don't exactly know how we're going to get there. We need to think of the easiest ways to make the transition. The transition is the key. If we can make the transition, we know, because the objective is so good, that we'll want to get there. Talk about an easy transition. Lotus Vehicle Engineering, you know Lotus, the really hot cars, came up with what they call a gem of an idea. What they're using GEM for is gasoline, ethanol, methanol. The idea here is literally to fool an engine that otherwise would just be able to run on ethanol and gasoline into using methanol without knowing it. Now, if you could do this, we could take a large number of cars that are on the road right now and start moving them off both ethanol and gasoline. Okay, so the GEM idea is to find exactly the right blend of gasoline, ethanol, and methanol. That in the United States, we have 11 million of these flex fuel vehicles on the road, and we're getting 4 or 5 million more every year. Make these cars think that the octane in that fuel think they're running exactly what they've been specified at the factory to run on with ethanol and gasoline, but substituting some of the ethanol with methanol. And the way you do that is you make the octane rating of this mixture, this blend, be exactly the same as it would be programmed in by the factory if you were just using ethanol and methanol. Ethanol and gasoline, sorry. You also make the volumetric energy constant in the blend equal to what it would be if there was just ethanol and gasoline in the mixture, and you make the latent heat exactly the same as if there was just ethanol and gasoline, but you are going to throw methanol in there. If you do this right, the driver and all the senses in the car do not know anything has changed. But instantly, your car can get off of as much as 56%, actually, though they're recommending not going over 50% of the ethanol. In other words, 50% of what you're putting in that engine will be methanol, i.e., we're right away reducing the constraints, the biological constraints of not being able to make enough ethanol, and we're getting off gasoline. Here's what it looks like on a plot. Okay, as you run along the x-axis here, you go from 0% ethanol all the way up to 85% ethanol. And what they've determined is that any position along that x-axis, I drew one vertical line there, right in the middle, which had 28% gasoline, 42% ethanol, and 28% methanol. But any one of those vertical lines, all the way from 0 ethanol up to the 85% ethanol that nominally your car, if it's a flex fuel car in the United States, can run on, any line along there, the engine doesn't know the difference. The driver doesn't know the difference. The emissions testing doesn't know the difference, though it might be a little less, but it'll more than pass. So it's a complete fool of the system. And yet, as you can see, that wedge of blue, which is the amount of methanol alcohol you are putting in the fuel, can get as large as 56% of the mixture. In other words, this is a way to begin to transition to the other alcohol without changing anything, according to Lotus, according to Saab also. And I'm going to try it in my own vehicle, which is a 2007 GMC Yukon XL. There are other companies that have tried this, and it seems to work. For example, Saab did it in their Aero X, Lotus in their XG 270E. There are Brazilian Fiats that can deal with all four fuels. And by the way, the fourth fuel here is compressed natural gas, so that car is a trip. Okay, and the EPA has tested these fuels in their test engines up in Ann Arbor, Michigan. More down to earth, and something closer to what we might see as a vehicle we can buy, would be a Honda Civic. Honda makes a Civic that will run on E20 to E100. In other words, 20% ethanol all the way up to 100% ethanol, and essentially see no horsepower and torque differences. That's the president of Honda standing in front of a Honda Civic there. This is 2006. They've been doing this for a long time now. This is in Brazil. They don't import that car into the United States. I think you, if you listen to this, should petition Honda to bring it here. And the one above it is a much smaller Fit, the Honda Fit. Again, these two models are sold here, but not with the E20 to E100 capability. Now, as we understand from the Lotus experiments and the Saab experiments, these E20 to E100 cars could as well, maybe for a few bucks more, maybe $30 more, be made M20 to M100 cars and essentially get no loss in power. And this is what's so important. We will see that those alcohol fuels, those cars running on these alcohol fuels, are just as good as running on gasoline. And of course, cheaper, and of course, will have lower emissions. Now, there's already a setup in this country to start making this happen. There's a pump, adjustable blend fuel pump in South Dakota. It's blending here. The way they set this up, it puts out 3 blends of ethanol. You can see the E20, E30, and E85, as well as gasoline. But theoretically, these adjustable fuel pumps could be adjusted to anything you want. That could be methanol, ethanol combinations in there. At the moment, we have 2,900 E85 filling stations in the United States. Most of them are just E85. They're not adjustable like the South Dakota one. They could be. There's a growing number. And as it turns out, Walmart is talking about adding 9,000 more E85 filling stations in their stores across the country. Well, let's hope that they put the adjustable ones in, and let's hope that a company like Honda can sell us these cars that they sell into Brazil and have been doing so now for 6 years. Why are we the poor cousins? Well, let's talk about money. Gasoline, I did this on the 19th of September 2012. Gasoline averaged across the country was $3.90 a gallon. Ethanol was $3.44 a gallon. There's a variation. I put the map up there. You can see the 15% variation from state to state across the country, but the average was $3.44. And since it's 25% less energy, on average you get that much less in an American car. You basically are paying $4.30 for an equivalent amount of energy if you buy ethanol. And according to the Methanol Institute, this is an estimate because we don't have those pumps in this country, if you put the tax on top of the current price of methanol, which at the time I did this was $1.30 a gallon, it would come to $3 for an equivalent amount of energy. So you can see right off the bat that if you're running your car on alcohol and you have that blending pump, you want to use more methanol than ethanol right now, because that ethanol from corn is expensive. When the ethanol is made cellulistically from wood chips and from natural gas and from carbon dioxide and wastewater and all these other ways we talked about, it'll come down in price. So you'll want the flexibility to decide that. And of course, gasoline might come back down to $2 or $1.50 a gallon. You'd actually want the flexibility to go back to gasoline if that was the case. Though I wouldn't hang my hat on it. Now, methanol might actually turn out to be much cheaper than that number. Here's the California experiment. They ran an experiment for 15 years running methanol cars in the state of California. In fact, they had 15,000 cars over that 15 years. And they negotiated with the methanol industry. Methanol at the time was costing $1.60 a gallon. Today it costs $1.30. But they got it for 67 cents a gallon. This is a copy right from a paper they published summarizing their program. Okay, so the methanol market is different from the oil market. It's not owned by the sheiks and OPEC. It's owned basically by us. If we make methanol here from our natural gas and our wastes, we'll own that market. We can negotiate in that market the way we would negotiate in any other free market. So the price is truly likely to be lower than the $3 value that we might have to pay today, since we import most of our methanol. In terms of carbon dioxide, well, the gasoline is basically the highest number on this little red line. You can see the dots and the error bars around them. And ethanol comes way down to the order of 50 or 60 grams of CO2 equivalent. But it could go to zero if you make it from cellulosic materials, like we talked about. And if you make it, and if you thought about methanol, and that you're making also from cellulosic materials, it can go down to a very low level compared to gasoline. So we can drastically reduce the CO2 in the number of grams equivalent of CO2 in our fuels by going to these alcohol fuels. That point that rises up at the end there, by the way, is hydrogen in a fuel cell. A little higher. Okay, future directions. Let's see if we can whip through this somewhat quickly. There are a lot of ways to make methanol and ethanol, as it turns out. We covered some for ethanol. Here are a few for methanol. You can reform natural gas. You can make it from the anaerobic digestion of organic waste, the pyrolysis of organic waste like wood chips, etc. You can use direct enzymes and solar transformation to make ethanol from CO2 and wastewater and the sun. You can dry reform methane and carbon dioxide and make methanol in a carbon dioxide negative process. And you can use the methanol as a fuel for fuel cells. These are all going to be future ways of using that alcohol to really run our transportation industry. In terms of the cars and the way to get the absolutely best performance, this is true actually for any fuel, but it works spectacularly for ethanol. This is again one of those plots of brake mean effective pressure versus RPM. This is from the EPA in a later talk that they gave, and that white line I drew through it would be basically the operating line of a hybrid. Now this is a hydraulic hybrid, but it could be the kind of hybrid that's in your the electric hybrid that's in a Prius, for example. In other words, the engine would be run along a line of essentially the highest efficiency that is possible. It wouldn't be accelerated and decelerated all the time. It'd be run at a more or less constant speed. And you could really pull the order of 40 to 42% efficiency out of it. You've got to realize that that's a huge amount compared to the 20 to 25% that we're getting from our engines now running on gasoline. It's double. It's enormously better. Just to show you how easy it is to make methanol. You can see the size of the computer, the laptop computer over on the side there. This is basically a system that will convert wood chips into methanol. It fits in a room. It can be in the back of a garage station, and you could be feeding natural gas into that garage station, and the owner could be filling the tank with methanol that you would ultimately use at the dispenser. But now let's talk about cow waste, cow manure. This could be pig manure, it could be chicken manure, turkey manure, you name it. You take that manure and you anaerobically digest it, and out will come methane and carbon dioxide. Using both of those, both the carbon dioxide and the methane, you can make methanol. And, of course, drive on it. This is a pretty efficient process, about 60% efficient, and otherwise, it's manure. You'd be throwing it out. Now, if the manure or human food waste, whatever, were thrown in a landfill is essentially an anaerobic digester. And essentially, you can use the same technique, the same process. You would get methane and carbon dioxide out of the landfill. You put it through the gasifier, make methanol, run your car on it. Well, you can also make methanol from hydrogen and CO2. And you say, well, hydrogen, where am I going to get that from? It just might be true that your local power plant, which if it was nuclear, or even if it was coal, is not actually shut off at night. A lot of the electricity produced is just wasted. What if that electricity was running an electrolyzer making hydrogen and CO2 from the smokestacks or from some other source was combined with it to make methanol and stored in a tank? You could then use that methanol as fuel. You would have fuel from essentially waste electricity. Go a step further. Let's take an anaerobic digester again. This time we're going to cook it. We're going to cook the methane and the CO2 to a high temperature. We're going to use the sun to do it. Suppose we concentrate solar energy on a reactor that cooks the methane and the CO2 above about 1100 degrees centigrade. That's called, we could dry reform the methane and come out, basically run it over, you come out with hydrogen and carbon dioxide, monoxide, and you run it over a catalyst and out comes methanol. This process, because the sun's putting energy in, is actually more than 100% efficient. This is a tremendous process. This is using not only the waste energy that you have, but the sun's energy and combining them to make fuel for your car. Clean, clean, clean fuel. All right, we're almost done. The main takeaway, so now, is don't be hung up with problems about corn ethanol, the fact that it uses lots of water and it's using a crop that we could use for food. Alcohols are definitely in our future, both ethanol and methanol. And largely down the road, they will be made from non-food origins. When that happens, they'll be cheaper and they won't vie for land or water or fertilizer. Remember again that alcohols are the only replacement for oil in the form of gasoline or diesel in internal combustion engines as we know them now. They are the most sensible, immediate liquid replacements. They are also, as it turns out, methanol will turn out to be the best carrier of energy for fuel cells. Methanol liquid is a liquid, and it carries in liquid form more hydrogen than liquefied hydrogen in the same volume. It's a tremendously good fuel for fuel cells, all three kinds. Whoever wins out, we don't really know or care right now. But if we have a methanol distribution system that we're using for decades and decades in our internal combustion engines, when the fuel cell of choice wins out 2, 3, or 4 decades from now, that fuel distribution system of methanol will be there for it. Okay, the technology's here. And as you can see, when the train finally made it, that train needed the cavalry to protect it. Well, are we going to need to bring out the cavalry to move this forward? Let's hope not. Let's hope you can see the merits here and help. Talk to your congressmen, talk to your senators, talk to your local politicians and say, why are we not able to do what the Swedes and the Brazilians and many, many other people are doing right now? Okay, if we can possibly move off the pot, we can go in 2 decades, in 20 years, from 100% oil basically today for transportation down to about 10% oil, where alcohol, that red part of the barrel will be a growing proportion. See, every year we make the order of 12 million cars. Well, 20 times 12, that's 240 million cars. Our total fleet today is only about 250 something million cars. We can essentially almost completely replace our fleet of gasoline and diesel vehicles with alcohol vehicles if we started making them today. So there are a couple of things we can do immediately. One is we have to find out whether the car you have right now can use methanol. And if it's not even an E85 car, can it use ethanol? There are arguments that say that the engines are not even logistically separated out from the engine plant to the assembly plant, and so your engine may be already set up to use alcohols. We don't know that. Maybe your fuel system isn't. Maybe you need $100 in the service department of your dealership to change this over, but wouldn't it be nice to know that? Try to think of ways to get this issue on the national political scene, because if it can be debated nationally, you'll find out if I've made any mistakes or all the people I've consulted with are wrong. If we are, we're going to be shifting our position a little bit so that we will be correct and we will be, in the end, winning the day. Okay? We want to prepare for alcohols in our future. We need our cars to be able to use them. We need to tell our representatives that we want that solution as quickly as possible, whether it's federal, local, or state. Now, if we can't get voluntary action on the part of the car companies and the politicians, it is also the case that there is a bill in Congress called the Open Fuels Standards Act that says automobile companies are going to have to make vehicles that can use all the alcohols and gasoline, and some vehicles that can use electricity and some vehicles that can use compressed natural gas. Fine. Let the market decide who's going to buy what. But the point is, if the car companies had to make cars that could run on alcohols and gasoline, and then they warranted them for us, we would have a running start. Remember, you will not miss the tetraethyl lead, and you will not miss your daily dose of benzene. So it's possible, in conclusion, that we can continuously wind down our use of oil, dramatically wind it down in a couple of decades. Rather than talking about doubling our fuel economy, we could get off oil essentially completely. It would really be a relief. Okay. We can do this by mixing alcohols in our internal combustion engines and eventually using the right kind of alcohol, which will be methanol, in fuel cells. We'll try to work our way towards making as much of these alcohols from renewables as possible, both ethanol and methanol. If we do that, we'll be energy independent, we'll be healthier, we'll be greener, and happier all the way around, because we will not have to send our children overseas to protect oil lines and get, well, you know the story way better than I can tell it. Thank you very much for listening. If there's anything I can do to further this motion or movement in your thinking and your, if you want to contact me, just email me at rfalco@energyresourcefulness.org. Thanks again for listening.